My name is Mokena Makeka. I am an architect and urban planner by training and currently a principal in Dahlberg Advisors. My background in terms of urbanizations and cities has given me insight in terms of the implications of demographic change, resource management, and how we can begin to preserve our natural inheritances, if you will, through the judicious use and strategy around city planning and urbanization. My work really centers around this sort of question of how do we make climate smart living possible? And that touches on energy issues, infrastructure development, public life, policy, as well as the preservation and conservation of natural resources. Climate change is important to us not because of an abstract idea of what temperature change might mean 100 years from now, but I can see the effects of it day to day in terms of many different communities on the planet and in Africa. But we're also seeing extreme weather patterns. So places which are drier are becoming more dry. We're seeing places which are cold are becoming more cold. And as these things evolve and change over time, plants which we might have relied on for food or for commerce are now beginning to grow in areas which would not traditionally grow, or alternatively, not be able to grow where they've grown for many years. So the net implication of this climate change is that it actually leads to food production change. It actually leads to change in terms of flora and fauna that has an impact on biodiversity. And the crisis that's facing our actually declining um, uh, assets when it comes from a biodiversity perspective is that all of these chains actually connect us together. So sustainable city is just as much about the products and the appliances which we buy and put into our houses, our washing machines and fridges, the age, or let's call it the life cycle of these assets, and how long do they survive before they go out into a landfill, which has to be, managed by a municipality or city. What happens to our batteries, which power our cell phones and our electric toothbrushes? But it's also about the furniture that we choose to buy in our homes. What is it made of? Where does the material come from? And it goes right down to the fabrics on our bodies and the food that we eat. So when we think about sustainable cities, it's really important to think of the city as an amalgam of all these different actions. It's energy, it's transport, it's food security, it's industrial production, it's ensuring that factories don't release dyes into rivers, which then has an impact on fish, which then has an impact on birds, which then has an impact on our own livelihoods. And quite interestingly, what has been shown, and we know for a fact because the world has endured a terrible pandemic in the form of the coronavirus, is that when human beings intrude on natural landscapes, at a pace at which those natural landscapes are unable to absorb or adjust, humans become exposed to a whole range of biological vectors which our bodies are not designed to respond to. So sustainability is also about human health. It's and understanding that the implications of rampant development actually puts our health at risk. Now, of late, I have actually pivoted away from this question of sustainability because, in some respects, it can be seen as a sort of utopia, the sustainable city where everything is perfect. Or it may be seen as an unattainable status for cities which are grappling with poverty, crime, uh, weak economies, etc., etc., etc. Climate smart economic development is where I think the conversation needs to head toward. And what I mean by climate smart is that it acknowledges a number of the complexities pertaining to um, the fact that all of these cities are imbalanced environments, which are imperfect. But we can start thinking about the wood that we're using for our buildings. Is it climate smart forests that actually produce these woods? Are they harvested in a climate smart way? Are they produced in a climate smart way? The furniture and the end products, are they climate smart? And you can extend that argument across every single human activity. So sustainable cities really for me is really about climate smart. It means that the resources that we consume and the waste that we create should be constructed around an understanding that we have one world. Now, if you look at the consumption patterns, particularly of many of our wealthy countries on the planet, their consumption per capita is equivalent to 2.3 planets. So, in other words, if everybody on Earth consumed in the same fashion as some of uh, the richest countries of the world, we would require 2.3 planets to sustain an equivalent lifestyle. We know this is impossible. We do not have 2.3 planets. So this means one of two things. One is that we have to ensure that there's more equity and parity. Those who have less access to energy, food security, decent human environments, we need to ensure that that changes and that we increase access to those opportunities. But also those who consume more and pollute more need to bring down their personal index from 2.3 far below current levels and ideally below 1. And this is the only way that we can end up having a planet in which we are in balance with the resources that we have, and that requires a discipline, if you will, in terms of climate smart urbanization, city making, and human activity, to be honest. And it's a substantial challenge because a lot of the issues that we're facing right now have never been faced before, because the amount of humans on the planet, if you think of the great acceleration since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in roughly 1830, and our population has significantly increased. So there was a time when human activity had no visceral impact on the planet, and has led to over 200 centuries now, or roughly, of fairly dangerous action because we assume that the planet can take it. We are the generation that is now seeing that, in fact, the planet cannot take it, and the implications of having a planet with 1.5 billion people versus 7 billion people are astronomical, and still subject to study, exercise, and learning. And the challenge is for those people who are unable to grapple with this pivotal change, if you will, because the assumption is that the old ways have worked well, so why must we change them? The reality is that they have not worked well. The planet has simply been absorbing, frankly, environmentally and ecologically problematic behavior by human beings. And now that capacity to absorb these actions is now diminished. I'll give you an example of a country like Lesotho and, let's say, South Africa, both of which have the production of stone fruits. Stone fruits are your apricots and peaches, etc. South Africa's economy has worked, particularly in the Western Cape, particularly worked well because of stone fruits and other sorts of fruit production. South African wines are famous around the world. Its juices, its products are exported globally. Due to climate change, and these sort of slight temperature shifts, it has an implication in terms of when these crops are now available to be harvested, and available for market. And a shift by even 1 to 2 to 3 weeks means that another part of the world might actually be able to provide its products earlier. And the price point between a 2 to 3 week shift in terms of the availability of, let's say, apricots and peaches can be as high as even 25 to 35% in terms of overall returns. So if you pit that against a country like Lesotho, which has historically been, let's say, behind in terms of the period at which its particular stone fruits are now available, and now that begins to move forward, all of a sudden a country like Lesotho might take advantage of climate change and say, how do we invest in these implications and see, can we increase our cold chain, let's call it support systems, so that local farmers who now have this produce are able to get it to market faster. And in a place like South Africa and the Western Cape, it might be a strategy of talking to these farmers and having predictive conversations and saying, your projections for yield and productivity around this particular commodity will probably shift within the next 20 years. So how do you begin to adjust? And I've seen this on farms which were amazing for the production of, let's say, wheat or let's say maize, have now pivoted towards animal husbandry because of these sorts of slight tweaks in climate change. So it's really about understanding our current behavior, and that's just agriculture. We can talk about energy production. We can talk about how we make our cities, the materials that we choose to construct our buildings. I think there's an opportunity set that comes out of grappling with these problems and being very creative in terms of understanding what is nature telling us and how do we respond accordingly. For example, we know that concrete and steel provides an abundance of the proportion of the materials that are used to make our cities. However, anything between 38 and 40% of emissions can be attributed to the production of these and similar materials in the production of buildings. And likewise, through the life of buildings, again, another 38% is due to how we run our buildings, the air conditioning, the lights, etc. Recognizing that urbanization is a huge contributor to the expulsion of carbon into the atmosphere, both during the production of a lifestyle of buildings, the question then arises, so what material choices could we use to make better cities? And that's where I think the opportunity comes in. Wood is an amazing material, but there are a whole range of nature-based solutions. But now imagine that a city of the size of Kinshasa, which I think will be the second largest city by the year 2100. I think the largest will be Lagos. Imagine a city like that making a decision that 50% of the buildings between now and 2100 will have 50% comparable carbon production. And we will do that by actually using wood. The first question is somebody says, well, do we have the wood for it? But that becomes the business opportunity because now it means that there's scenarios where cities and developers can go into partnership with plantations, go into partnership with forest communities. There can be a forward-looking investment in terms of afforestation, not only to green the planet and to protect biodiversity, but to actually create the timber stock that will be required to make climate smart construction in the future. This unlocks new business opportunities which do not exist. So I think the challenge of development for African countries is not framing climate change as a limitation of choices about what you can and cannot do, but it's actually an opening up of solution sets about what you can do to tackle climate change, let alone the fact that there are increasingly substantial amounts of empathetic capital for climate change credible products. It will take time for us to agree on what that credibility baseline is. There will be lots of debates about greenwashing. There'll be lots of discussions about unscrupulous actors entering into the climate change economic space and trying to, mop up this capital. But I think the overall trajectory is that on the one hand, there are resources, whether it's in the form of ideas, whether it's in the form of capital, whether it's in the form of people who are working very hard at the coalface of beginning to, and I'm quite intentional about that pun with coalface, but who are quite intentional about being at the frontier, if you will, of offering solutions. I think every single African country has a role and an opportunity to play in terms of internal job creation through addressing various aspects of climate change. So a country like Lesotho, with its abundant water resources, can think very critically about being a hydroelectric power supplier to its neighboring country, South Africa, which has endemic power shortages. And using that is a much more substantive way of engaging with power production than, let's say, investing in coal-powered stations. So I cannot think of a single country that on the continent, for sure, that that does not have the opportunity to be a beneficiary of climate change if it makes the right strategic decisions and goes into the right partnerships about how does one unlock business and green livelihoods around addressing climate change. So I don't see climate change as a funnel of limiting opportunity. I think it's a wake-up call to how we think about our cities, how we think about food production, our transport systems, how we think about job creation. Our industrial revolution as a continent will not be a what I'd call a petrol-driven revolution, as you might see in some parts of the Middle East. It certainly won't be a revolution driven by extraction from other parts of the world. In other words, there's no colonial, let's call it largesse in the background that is enabling our revolution. Our agricultural, economic, and climate change revolution on the continent will be intimately tied to the solution sets that are present in engaging with climate change. I have a lot of empathy for clients, people, governments trying to find what I describe as the silver bullet to solve the climate change challenge when it comes to construction. The reality is that there's no one single solution that will address every single aspect of climate smart construction. And I think that's an important piece. Buildings are highly complex structures. They have to repel water from the outside. They have to let light in. They have to mediate temperatures so that it's livable. They have to ensure that there's limited moisture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So every single architectural project or product will have a range of different components in it, right down to the door handles. So there are a whole range of materials and assets inside a building, from the furniture, the fittings, the equipment, et cetera. However, when we think about climate change mitigation, we want to ensure that carbon doesn't go into the atmosphere. So we need to think of what are called, how do we think of buildings as carbon stores or materials which are carboniferous? In other words, they absorb carbon. There's been lots of research on various different paints using calcium components and other sorts of molecules that are actually attracting carbon. But we do know that if you use wood, and there are many parts of the world, if you go to Asia, Japan, or parts of Europe, where some wooden structures have been standing for hundreds of years, that is effectively locking the carbon in place. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to make buildings that are more resilient, and we don't demolish and recycle buildings every 2 to 3 years, depending on the whim of a particular client. Buildings really should not be seen as disposable commodities, but they should be seen as assets which stand in the landscape for a minimum of 20, 30, or 40 years. So that's one of the important principles, which is the life cycle of a building. And ideally, these buildings should be up even for 100 years. Now, aside from that sort of ethos of, demolish and rebuild versus actually let's add, refurbish, and ensure that the carbon doesn't get lost into the atmosphere, nature-based solutions and bio-based construction is very much my particular trajectory at this moment. I've designed with concrete. I've designed with steel on a number of buildings. I've won awards for it. Very proud of that portfolio of work, but I was not cognizant of my impact on the climate conditions and through these material choices. So what we need to do now is to start thinking of materials which are actually good for it. So bamboo, for example, is a fast-growing wood, which means it actually absorbs, or actually grass, it actually absorbs the carbon fairly quickly. It can be used for flooring. It can be used for various different materials. Yes, there are lots of debates about the glues. Are they safe? There's lots of innovation happening right now. And as I've mentioned, some of these products are still not yet up to the minimum standard of what we would deem to be climate smart materials. But certainly, if I between that versus a linoleum floor made from PVC materials, I would definitely opt for the nature-based option. If I think of the structural components of a building, where historically one would use steel for, let's say, pillars or columns, If I can replace it with wood, I would do it absolutely. So I think it's about making a number of thoughtful decisions around how we construct our buildings and our cities, and looking at these as a critical aspect for combating climate change. So I'm an advocate of timber. And I'm an advocate of timber being used in various guises, whether it's structural components, whether it's flooring, whether it's boarding, whether it's in the furniture, making composites with it and adding it to make other sort of stronger materials. There's an amazing amount of material innovation of the last 20 to 30 years that we can draw upon. And as we speak, many scientists and actors are working in the space to make these solutions possible for and affordable for us. So yes, my short answer to that question is that bio-based construction is a fundamental of it's the wood chips that fall from when you cut down a tree. They don't have to be left onto the ground to decompose. Yes, you can do that, but you can and but you can also take those fibers and weave them into even clothing. There's lots of innovation right now where fashion items are being made from wood. Um, of course, we know paper, matchsticks, and other sorts of other products. But I'm really intrigued and excited by how the humble tree and its various different species, of which there are thousands, can be deployed in various ways to supply all of our needs. For example, even plastic containers, which you might associate for drinks and so on. There are ways in which you can take the lignin, which is part of the wood fiber component, and you can actually make plastic substitutes. So the wood fiber is incredibly versatile as a material. It's not just structural, it can be malleable, and it can offer us a whole range of solutions. In fact, evidence has been shown that there's not a single product, to my knowledge, that is made out of plastic that cannot be made through using wood or wood fibers. Essentially, we can replace all of those products with solutions from the natural world. So it's such a good question because a number of people have said to me, why would you suggest using timber? Don't we need to protect our forests? And again, it's a sort of zero-sum logic, which really isn't helpful in terms of understanding the problem. And I'll explain to you why. One is we absolutely have to protect our current forests, particularly the ones which have high degrees of biodiversity, particularly the ones which are vital to the hydrological cycle of the planet. I think of the Congo Basin and the ecosystem services that that particular mosaic of tropical forest provides to the world, actually sequestering more carbon than the Amazon, and it's actually the world's primary lung at the moment. And I say a couple of things to these actors who believe that the way to protect forests is to not touch them. One, forests have high value. In fact, we don't value our forests as much as they should be. If we begin to take into account the ecosystem services, if we begin to take into account the value that's provided by biodiversity, if we begin to take into account their impact on the planet, their value should be far much, much higher. And because of the low value of forests at the moment, it means that it's fairly innocuous for a person to decide to illegally log and sell that piece of timber at a very, very low price because the forest has a low value. What we found is that by the industrialization of specific parts of the forest, the value of the forest increases. And there's a point at which the value becomes so high that it's much more attractive for a forest community person to say, I'm going to keep this tree because the returns that I get from harvesting this tree down the line, or even through a forest concessionaire partnership, is actually higher than me chopping it down now for wood or for firewood, or to sell it very quickly to an unscrupulous actor at the local port. So in many ways, it's the industrialization and the elevation of the value of forests that will allow us to protect them. In Gabon, we have found that there's been a substantial increase in the amount of elephants that have actually um, gravitated and live more in forest concession plantation areas than natural forest landscapes. And they do this because in those forest plantations, they're better policed. So the elephants are aware that their death rates are lower in plantations than they are in natural forests. So isn't it fascinating that through the economic imperative, if you will, of plantations and planting trees and actually supporting biodiversity, that nature is now finding a foothold where it wouldn't find in other sorts of places. Absolutely mind-boggling. And we're seeing this with gorillas, we're seeing this with various other species. So the overall lesson I think that needs to be conveyed is that 100% we do not want to industrialize all of our forest resources. We're not saying that. We definitely have to keep large proportions, if not more. I mean, the current narrative is around 30%. I think it should be 50% of these forests should actually be devoid of human activity, period. But I do think we need to increase our forest cover substantially. Evidence has shown that since the 1830s, arguably, the world has lost about 30% of its forest cover. 30%. Which means that in order for us to get back to pre-industrial levels of forest coverage, we actually need to increase our forest coverage by 30%. And if we increase our forest coverage by 30%, I don't think it's implausible that 50% of that increase should be dedicated towards productive, biodiverse plantation landscapes. The remaining portion could be very well the creation of new, intact, rewilding notions of how do we create natural environments. And I think the trajectory is to say, in order to reach that increased target, of which 30%, by the way, is very much beyond current human patterns of behavior at the moment. It's, we'll be lucky if we get even to 10% increased cover, let alone arresting current deforestation. But if you imagine with me, if you will, a world in which we say we need to plant 30% more trees globally, different countries will have a different ratio of what needs to contribute to that increased 30%. Through the creation of that new abundance, if you will, that we can possibly increase biodiversity. We can definitely create the stocks that we will need for the creation of future cities, and the necessity for fibers to create the various products that I've described that are possible from wood. And that, in fact, is almost the beauty of creating a renewable resource, is that unlike oil, which is finite, if we plant forests, we're actually growing our own resources for the future. And that's an incredible asset to have. So I would encourage a young person to think of really trees in a number of ways. One is that trees are better for our cities. They bring local temperature down. They give us shade. As human beings, we have a natural relationship to nature. So it's good for our well-being. The second part that I would say is that from a neighborhood level, leafier, green environments are always, compared to areas which do not have trees, valued higher. The parks, the streets which have the trees are always seen as more attractive. So your real estate actually increases by planting trees, a real estate value, if you will. And then there's the third part that we've been discussing right now, which are the broader systemic implications of having a more green environment and the job creation that comes out of that. Not all areas are suitable for trees because human beings do live in places which are very difficult for trees to grow. We can think of the northern part of the continent and certainly large parts of southern Africa, savanna landscape, where trees would not normally have been there. My answer to that is one is that we need to think about appropriate afforestation. Planting the right tree in the right place is, I think, a very important part of the discourse, but also to remember that human agency has the ability to transform environments. Johannesburg, by all accounts, is seen as the world's largest unnatural forest because it was actually a savanna landscape prior to about 1860. But now it is a very green city in many respects. So environments can be transformed for the better. Obviously, we must work with our environmental colleagues to ensure that we're not destroying ecosystems and replacing them with alien ones, which we do not have a full sense of their impact on ourselves or on the environment. But I think we should seize our ingenuity as a species to answer those questions rigorously, to plant new trees for a future generation, to make better environments where we live, work, and play, but to also create a resource against which our children and grandchildren will be able to create jobs using the natural resources that are near to them. And in many respects, in closing, this is how it has been for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The current concrete jungles that we associate urbanization with largely are a product of a boom of construction that started in the 1920s, 1930s, up until today. So this is a very small portion of our history on the planet. In fact, 99.99% of our history has been building with nature-based materials. It's only this recent period where we have overextended ourselves by not using nature-based solutions. So we can tell that young person in Africa that we are actually returning to our climate-smart roots by using nature as an ally in the making of better livelihoods. My message to you, my fellow Africans, and to the world at large, is that climate change is daunting. And you might feel that your actions as an ordinary person might not make a difference. You might feel that your decision not to fly and to rather take a Zoom call is not going to have an impact on the planet. You might feel that your decision to walk as opposed to driving is not going to change the world. The truth is that these small actions add up. Every single micro action that we do together as a community has an impact and an influence in terms of systemic change that we would like to see. But because our day-to-day actions are not going to instantly transform the fortunes of the planet, be patient with yourselves. It is a journey as we move towards this just energy and ecological transition. Be patient with yourself in terms of working towards a process in which the fruits of which will be seen over time, but also be excited. Be excited because a lot of the narrative around climate change has been a fear-based discourse, which produces a scarcity mindset, which says, well, I need to develop now. I can't worry about what's going to happen 20 years from now. I need jobs today. I'm hungry now. My argument to you, my fellow Africans, is that that is precisely how we need to think differently about this problem. If we are aware of scarcity of jobs today, if we are aware of food scarcity in our cities, if we are aware of shanty towns that we would like to see eradicated, if we are aware of rivers that need to be rehabilitated, and if we are aware of food security that we need to bring back together, it's through climate change solutions and climate change-oriented businesses that we can begin to make a difference. Small actions, plant a tree, be a bit more responsible. But we should be thinking about this as an economic opportunity for our countries, and we should be pushing our governments in particular, who have the ability to make the long-term and the wide-scale decisions that are necessary for all citizens to come to the party. We need to ask our governments to start working towards bio-based construction. We need them to think much more intelligently about hydroelectric power. We need to think much more strategically about how do we grow our ecological resources and biodiversity. So we as citizens can do two things. One is the day-to-day decisions, but our bigger impact is on making sure that our governments, our large businesses, the corporates that produce our cars, our clothes, our washing machines, that they come to the party because they work at the scale that will have the impact that we would like to see. So think of yourselves as a conscious consumer and a micro decision maker in the bigger decisions of this planet. I urge you to take this opportunity and to think very carefully about how you would like to leave this planet. What would you like to leave for future generations? And if you were in the shoes of the people who were 20, 30, or 40 years ahead of you, what would you have asked them to do differently so that your life would have been better today? Thank you.